There are places in this world that are cursed, not in the old-fashioned sense with witches and hexes, but in a modern way, cursed by science, by ambition, by secrets buried so deep they tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Hawkins, Indiana was one of those places, a town that looked so ordinary it was practically a parody of American life, all while sitting on top of a wound that bled into another, darker world. We're about to pull back the curtain on every secret, every monster, and every sacrifice that turned this sleepy town into the epicenter of an interdimensional war. Before we start, where are you tuning in from? Hopefully not Hawkins. This is the complete story of a town that went strange, a story that begins not with a monster, but with a man who believed he could control them. The story of Hawkins's damnation begins in the shadow of the Cold War, a time of paranoia and radical ambition where the line between science and madness was dangerously thin. At the heart of this shadow was a man named Dr. Martin Brenner, a figure of quiet intensity and chilling paternalism. Brenner was a visionary, but his vision was devoid of empathy. He saw the human mind not as a source of consciousness or soul, but as an untapped arsenal, a weapon waiting to be unlocked for the American war machine. He was the chief architect of Project MKUltra, a real CIA-sanctioned program focused on mind control, and his domain was the sterile, windowless labyrinth of Hawkins National Laboratory. The lab, from the outside, was a nondescript government building. Inside, it was a temple to a dark science, a place where human beings were reduced to variables in a terrifying equation. His subjects were often unwitting volunteers, people from the fringes of society, students, wanderers, the mentally ill, lured in by promises of a few dollars. They were test subjects for a cocktail of psychedelic drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture, all designed to crack open the psyche and release the power Brenner was convinced lay dormant within. One of these volunteers was a young woman named Terry Ives. Terry was a product of her time, an idealist caught in the powerful current of the 1960s counterculture. She was fiercely independent, curious, and perhaps a little naive. When she saw the flyer for the university study, she saw a small act of rebellion, a way to contribute to something vaguely scientific while earning some pocket money. She had no idea she was signing up to be a test rat in Brenner's maze. What made Terry different, what made her the unwitting mother of a psychic apocalypse, was that when she entered the program, she was pregnant. The drugs they pumped into Terry's system were potent, mind-altering substances. Combined with the sensory deprivation tanks, dark, silent pods where the subject floated in saline water, cut off from the world, the experiments were designed to push the human mind to its breaking point. But inside Terry, this chemical and psychological assault had an unforeseen side effect. The drugs didn't just affect her. They resonated with the developing consciousness within her womb. The fetus, a nascent being named Jane, was marinating in a soup of hallucinogens and psychic exploration. Her brain, still forming, was being fundamentally rewired, imprinted with the very abilities Brenner was so desperately trying to create. He didn't know it yet, but Brenner wasn't building a weapon. He was watching one grow naturally in the most unexpected of places. The birth was shrouded in secrecy and clinical cruelty. Brenner and his staff orchestrated a seamless deception. They told Terry that she had miscarried in the 3rd trimester, a tragic but plausible complication. They manufactured a story, burying the truth under layers of forged documents and medical lies, while Terry was sent home to spiral into a grief that would slowly, over years, sharpen into an unshakable, obsessive conviction that her daughter was alive, the real Jane was taken. She was spirited away into the deepest levels of Hawkins' lab, her existence erased from the outside world. She was given a new name, a designation tattooed onto her wrist like a brand, unravel. She was now an experiment, a priceless asset in Brenner's collection. She became 11. Life for 11 was a void. Her world was a sterile triptych of white walls, white gowns, and the bland, mushy food served on a tray. There were no colors, no textures, no experiences beyond what Brenner allowed. Her only human contact was with the man she was taught to call Papa, and a handful of other numbered children, each with their own unique psychic gifts. They were a strange, broken family, competing for the warmth of Brenner's approval, which he doled out with calculated precision. His praise was a ray of sunshine in their colorless world. His disappointment was a terrifying absolute cold. He was their god, their father, and their jailer, all at once. From a young age, 11's powers were extraordinary, far surpassing the others. She could crush a soda can with a focused glare, a parlor trick that made Brenner's eyes shine with a cold, proprietary light. He saw her potential and pushed her relentlessly. The training was brutal, a constant cycle of tests and punishments. He would force her to telekinetically harm a cat, and when she refused, her grief and defiance warring within her, he would drag her away, throwing her into the solitary confinement of a dark, cramped cell. He was trying to break her empathy, to sand down the human parts of her, until only the weapon remained. The centerpiece of her training was the sensory deprivation tank, a far more advanced version of the one her mother had used. He called it the bath. Submerged in the dark, she was taught to let her mind roam, to travel into a psychic space she called the void, an infinite black plane submerged in a thin layer of water. It was from this space that she could become the perfect spy, listening in on the conversations of Russian generals, a ghost in their machines. But Brenner was a man of insatiable ambition. Spying on enemy combatants was one thing, but he had detected something else, a faint, persistent, psychic whisper from somewhere else, a signal from an unknown place. He became obsessed. He didn't know what was on the other side, but to a man like Brenner, any locked door was a challenge. He pushed 11 further than she had ever gone before, ordering her to make contact with the source of this otherworldly signal. He was asking a child, already traumatized and terrified, to knock on the door of a dimension he could not comprehend. The psychic strain was immense. During one session, the effort to reach this unknown entity was so great that blood began to trickle from her nose, a stark red line against her pale, frightened face. This became the physical sign of her power, the toll it took on her small body. But she was a child, desperate for her papa's approval, for a brief moment of his warmth. So she reached out, her consciousness screaming into the blackness of the void. And for the first time, something screamed back. The contact was a moment of pure, undiluted terror. In the familiar black emptiness of her void, she was no longer alone. She felt a presence, a vast, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness. It had a form, a grotesque body that she would later describe with the trembling voice of a child who has seen a true monster. It was tall and slender, with no face, just a smooth, featureless head that could peel open like a monstrous flower, revealing endless rows of needle-sharp teeth. It was a predator, a demogorgon. Any sane person, any true father figure, would have recoiled in horror, shut down the experiment, and recognized the profound existential danger they had just brushed up against. But Brenner was not a sane man. He was a scientist on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. He saw only success. He ordered her to do it again. "I want you to make contact one more time," he commanded, his voice soft but unyielding. This single decision, born of ego and ambition, was the fulcrum on which the fate of Hawkins would turn. The final contact was the catalyst for the entire tragedy. They placed 11 back into the tank, this time for a direct, unshielded connection. The psychic pressure in the room was palpable. The heavy concrete walls of the chamber began to groan and crack. The lights flickered violently, casting the scene in a strobe of panic. Floating in the dark water, 11, fueled by a mixture of fear and a child's desperate need to please her father, reached out her mind and touched the monster. This time, the connection was not a whisper, it was a physical bridge. The monster became aware of her world. The sheer terror of that moment, the psychic feedback of touching a being of pure, predatory hunger, erupted from 11 in a wave of uncontrollable power. In the lab, the crack in the wall behind the tank tore open. It wasn't a crack anymore, it was a wound, a glistening, pulsating tear in the very fabric of reality. It was a gate, and from the fleshy, bleeding maw of this doorway between worlds, the Demogorgon, drawn by the psychic explosion, stepped through. The lab was plunged into utter chaos. Alarms shrieked, scientists ran for their lives, their screams cut short by the creature's terrifying roar. In the midst of the pandemonium, 11, small and terrified, saw her chance. The monster she had let in was a horrifying distraction. She slipped out of the tank, a ghost in a hospital gown, and ran. She fled the sterile prison that was the only home she had ever known and disappeared into the cold, rainy woods of Hawkins, Indiana. She was a weapon that had just misfired catastrophically, a traumatized child escaping a nightmare of her own creation. The gate she had opened remained, a bleeding sore between dimensions, a permanent open door to the upside down. And on the night of November 6, 1983, a young boy named Will Byers, innocently riding his bike home from a Dungeons & Dragons game, would become the first victim to be pulled through it by the monster she had unleashed. The disappearance of a single child was the first domino to fall, setting in motion a chain reaction that would drag a small town, a grieving mother, a weary sheriff, and 3 very loyal best friends into the heart of a war they couldn't possibly imagine. The vanishing of Will Byers sent a shockwave through the idyllic, almost suffocatingly normal town of Hawkins. To the adults, it was a tragedy cloaked in familiar terms, a runaway, a kidnapping, the kind of terrible thing that happened in other, bigger places. Police Chief Jim Hopper, a man hollowed out by his own past griefs, initially treated it as such, his weary cynicism a shield against the town's mounting panic. But to Will's mother, Joyce, it was something else entirely. She refused to accept the simple explanations, her maternal instinct screaming a truth that sounded like madness to everyone else. Will was alive, and he was trying to communicate with her through the lights in her house. She became a pariah of grief, frantically stringing up Christmas lights, her sanity fraying as she tried to decipher the ghostly messages from her son. While the adults grappled with a mystery they were ill-equipped to solve, Will's 3 best friends, Mike Wheeler, Dustin Henderson, and Lucas Sinclair, refused to be bystanders. They were not just friends, they were a party, a Dungeons & Dragons fellowship whose bond was forged in the sacred space of Mike's basement. Their worldview was shaped by fantasy, by epic quests and heroic archetypes. When their friend, their cleric, was taken by an unknown evil, they didn't just wait for the adults to find him, they started their own campaign. Armed with binoculars, compasses, and walkie-talkies, they set out into the treacherous Mirkwood, the woods where Will's bike had been found. The night was dark and stormy, a perfect cliché of a horror story that felt terrifyingly real. It was in this charged atmosphere, amidst the lashing rain and menacing shadows, that their quest took an unexpected turn. A small, shivering figure stumbled into the beams of their flashlights. It was a girl with a shaved head, wearing a dirty, oversized t-shirt that looked suspiciously like a hospital gown. She was terrified, mute, and had a strange bleeding nose. This was their first encounter with 11. The reaction within the party was immediate and divisive. Lucas Sinclair, the pragmatist and skeptic of the group, saw her as a threat, a dangerous anomaly. His loyalty to Will was absolute, and this weirdo was a distraction, a potential trap. He was the ranger of the party, always on the lookout for danger, and his every instinct told him this girl was bad news. Dustin Henderson, the affable, lisping mediator, and the group's scientific mind, was a mixture of caution and uncontainable curiosity. He was a collector of strange facts and phenomena, and this girl was the strangest phenomenon he had ever encountered. He saw the logic in Lucas's fear, but was too fascinated to reject her outright. It was Mike Wheeler, the dungeon master and the heart of the group, who made the decisive call. Where Lucas saw danger and Dustin saw a puzzle, Mike saw a person in desperate need of help. He felt an immediate, powerful surge of empathy for this lost, frightened girl. It was his home, his basement, and he decided to offer her sanctuary. Smuggling her into his house, past his oblivious parents and bickering sisters, Mike brought 11 into the party's headquarters. The basement was a haven of fantasy and friendship, adorned with posters of The Thing and Jaws, filled with comic books and D&D paraphernalia. For 11, who had only known the sterile white of the lab, it was a wonderland of color and comfort. Mike gave her a blanket fort, food, specifically his Eggos, and a level of kindness she had never experienced. He spoke to her patiently, trying to understand who she was and where she came from. In return, she offered him the only name she had, pulling up her sleeve to reveal the tattoo on her wrist. 11. The introduction of 11 fundamentally altered the group's dynamic. Mike's basement became a secret-keeping bunker, the quest to find Will now inextricably linked with the new mission of protecting Elle. The fault line between Mike and Lucas deepened into a chasm. Lucas argued with sound logic that she was dangerous. "She knows about Will," he'd insist, pointing out that her appearance at the exact time of Will's disappearance was too much of a coincidence. He suspected she was a Russian spy, a monster, or worse, somehow responsible for what had happened. Mike, driven by his growing affection and protective instincts, defended her fiercely. Dustin found himself in the middle, trying to play peacemaker while being secretly awed by the strange things that happened around Elle. The first time she demonstrated her power, using her telekinesis to slam a door shut to stop Lucas from telling Mike's mum, Dustin's face was a perfect portrait of ecstatic terror. This was real-life magic. The true turning point came when 11, using their D&D board as a visual aid, explained Will's fate. She took the miniature representing Will and placed it on the board. Then she picked up the terrifying two-headed Demogorgon figure. She flipped the game board over to its black, featureless underside and placed Will's miniature there, with the Demogorgon looming over it. "Hiding," she whispered. She was showing them. Will wasn't dead or lost in their world. He was trapped in another place, a dark echo of their reality, a place she implicitly understood. The Upside Down. This revelation solidified her place in the party. She wasn't just a stray they had found, she was their only link to Will. She was their mage, their weapon. The faction was now fully formed, a group of children bound by a secret so immense it dwarfed all their internal squabbles. Their quest was no longer just a search for a lost friend. It was a campaign against a real-life monster from another dimension, and this strange, powerful girl was their only hope of winning. The uneasy alliance forged in Mike Wheeler's basement was rapidly evolving into a dedicated fighting force, a small militia of children standing against a tide of darkness. They were a faction born of loyalty, now armed with a secret weapon in the form of 11. However, they were fighting a war on two fronts. On one side were the bad men from Hawkins' lab, led by a relentless Dr. Brenner, who was hunting for his escaped asset with cold clinical determination. On the other was the Demogorgon, the apex predator from the Upside Down, now free to hunt in a new, target-rich environment, drawn to the scent of blood and the psychic echoes of its creator. The stakes, once tragically simple, find Will, had metastasized into a desperate battle for the survival of everyone involved. Their first, truly organized mission was an attempt to amplify 11's powers to contact Will. The plan, a brilliant piece of adolescent ingenuity, involved breaking into Hawkins Middle School to use the powerful Heathkit ham radio in the AV club room, a sacred space for the nerds of the party. It was their first foray into enemy territory, a stealth mission carried out with the seriousness of a military operation. Inside the darkened school, they hooked 11 up to the radio, hoping the machine's power would act as a psychic amplifier, allowing her to punch through the dimensional barrier. The effort was immense. To find Will's faint, ghostly voice in the static-filled ether of the Upside Down, 11 had to push her abilities to a dangerous new level. The lights in the school flickered and died, and the psychic toll was starkly visible, the twin streams of blood running from her nose, the profound exhaustion that left her pale and trembling. But it was a success. For a few miraculous, heart-stopping seconds they heard him. Will's voice, fragile and terrified, singing his favorite song, "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" came through the speaker. It was proof. He was alive, trapped somewhere they now knew was real. But their triumph was short-lived. The massive power surge required for the contact acted as a flare in the dark, alerting Brenner and his agents to their location. The school was no longer safe. This small victory led to the first major conflict, a brutal test of their courage at the local quarry. After a confrontation with school bullies Troy and James, Mike was forced into a horrifying choice: watch Dustin be toothlessly maimed or jump off the high cliff into the water below. Mike, in an act of selfless friendship, jumped. As he plummeted towards the water, 11, who had been watching from the woods, reacted with a furious protective instinct. The years of pent-up fear, anger, and pain from the lab coalesced into a single, powerful act. She used her mind to stop Mike in midair, levitating him safely back to the top of the cliff. Then, turning her attention to the bullies, she broke Troy's arm with a flick of her wrist. It was a terrifying display, but for the party, it was a moment of absolute clarity. She wasn't just a tool, she was one of them. She was their protector. This event, however, drew even more unwanted attention. The final confrontation began to coalesce at Hawkins Middle School, the same place they had first heard Will's voice. It became the designated ground for a last stand, a desperate, multi-pronged plan conceived by the now united factions of kids, teenagers, Nancy, Jonathan, and Steve, and adults, Hopper and Joyce. The plan was complex. Hopper and Joyce would breach the Upside Down through the main gate at the lab to physically retrieve Will. Nancy and Jonathan, joined by a newly courageous Steve Harrington, would lure the Demogorgon to the buyer's house, intending to trap and kill it. The kids, with a now weakened 11, were supposed to remain hidden and safe at the school, but the Demogorgon, drawn to the psychic residue and the literal blood that had been shed, had other plans. It bypassed the trap at the buyer's house and headed straight for the school. The siege of Hawkins Middle was pure chaos. It began not with the monster but with Dr. Brenner's forces. They swarmed the school, moving with ruthless efficiency, their sole objective to capture 11. The kids were cornered, their escape routes cut off. It was here, trapped in a hallway with the men who represented her entire life of trauma, that 11 unleashed the full, horrifying extent of her power. This wasn't about crushing cans or levitating toys anymore. This was about survival. As Brenner approached her, his voice deceptively soft, trying to coax her back, she let out a scream of pure, undiluted rage. Her eyes were wide, and the air around her seemed to crackle with an invisible, deadly energy. The agents flanking Brenner froze. Blood began to pour from their eyes, a grotesque parody of her own symptoms. Then, with a sickening wet crunch, their bodies collapsed, their brains fatally hemorrhaged by the sheer force of her psychic assault. It was a gruesome, shocking display of power, and it saved them. But the effort left her almost completely drained, on the verge of catatonia. The scent of all that blood, however, acted as a dinner bell. The Demogorgon smashed through the brick wall of the school, its terrifying shriek echoing through the empty halls. The final battle had arrived. It cornered them in Mr. Clark's science classroom. Lucas, ever the pragmatist, unleashed a desperate barrage of stones from his wrist rocket slingshot, a futile but incredibly brave act that bought them precious seconds. The creature, enraged, swatted him aside, knocking him unconscious. It turned its attention to Mike, who stood protectively in front of the weakened 11. It was the end. Seeing her friends, her only real family, about to be slaughtered, 11 found one final desperate reserve of strength. She stood, her small frame radiating an impossible power, and faced the monster she had unwittingly unleashed. She looked back at Mike, a single tear tracing a path through the grime and blood on her cheek, and whispered a heartbreaking farewell. Goodbye, Mike. It was an apology, a promise, and an acceptance of her fate. Then she turned to the Demogorgon, raised her hand, and screamed, not a scream of fear, but of pure, annihilating force. Every light in the room exploded. A wave of raw energy erupted from her, enveloping the monster. The Demogorgon shrieked in agony as its physical form was torn apart, atom by atom, until nothing remained but a cloud of black, swirling ash. And then, in the sudden, ringing silence, 11 was gone. She had vanished with the creature. The aftermath was one of stunned, grief-stricken silence. Will was on his way home, saved. The monster was gone. But their savior, their friend, was gone too, leaving an unfillable void in their party, and a profound sense of loss that marked the true cost of their victory. The year following 11's sacrificial vanishing act was a lost era, a period of quiet grief and secret endurance for all the survivors of the battle for Hawkins. On the surface, the town desperately tried to return to normal, with the official story blaming the bizarre events on a chemical spill from the lab and the tragic, though ultimately resolved, case of a lost boy. But beneath this fragile veneer of normalcy, the trauma festered. Will Byers was home, but he was not whole. He was plagued by terrifying episodes, moments where he would freeze, his consciousness violently pulled back into the grey, ashen, and terrifyingly empty world of the Upside Down. He was a spy who had returned from the cold, but he had brought the shadow of that other place back with him. The rest of the party, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, grappled with a loss they couldn't speak of. Mike, in particular, was haunted. Every single night for 353 nights he would go to his basement fort, turn on his supercom, and call out her name into the static. "Elle, are you there? It's Mike. Over." It was a ritual of hope against hope, a testament to a promise he refused to believe was broken. Meanwhile, 11 was not destroyed. In the cataclysmic act of destroying the Demogorgon, the sheer force of the energy backlash had hurled her into the one place she never wanted to be again, the Upside Down. Her survival there was a testament to her raw power and resilience. She navigated the decaying, spore-filled echo of Hawkins, a ghost in a haunted world, until she found a weak spot, a small, pulsating organic portal in the walls of Hawkins Middle School. With a final, desperate push of her will, she clawed her way back into her own dimension. But the world she returned to was no longer safe. The bad men were still out there, engaged in a massive cover-up, hunting for any loose ends, and she was the biggest loose end of all. For weeks, she became a feral child, surviving alone in the harsh Indiana winter. She used her powers to hunt squirrels for food, her only companions the memories of her friends. She was a ghost, unable to reach out, unable to go home. In her solitude, she would use the void, her psychic plane, to watch Mike as he called for her each night. His voice was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of the life, the connection she had sacrificed and now couldn't reclaim. It was Police Chief Jim Hopper who found her. Hopper, a man still wrestling with the ghost of his own lost daughter, Sarah, had never fully accepted the official story. He had been leaving Eggo waffles, Eleven's favorite food, in a small box in the woods, a quiet offering to a ghost he hoped was still out there. Following his gut and a trail of clues only a seasoned cop would notice, he tracked her down. In this shivering, traumatized girl with haunted eyes, Hopper saw a chance for a redemption he didn't feel he deserved. He saw a child who desperately needed a father, and he, a man who had forgotten how to be one, needed a daughter. He took her to the only place he could think of that was truly off the grid, his grandfather's old, derelict hunting cabin, a dilapidated shack hidden deep in the woods, miles from anywhere. This cabin became Eleven's new world and her new prison. It was a gilded cage built with love and fear. Hopper, terrified of losing another child, established a strict set of rules. Rule 1, always keep the curtains drawn. Rule 2, only open the door for his secret knock. Rule 3, the most important and most painful, never, ever leave. Life in the cabin was a psychological crucible for them both. It was a home filled with the ghosts of their shared and separate traumas. Hopper's grief for Sarah was a palpable presence, contained in a dusty box of her belongings he kept hidden away. Eleven's trauma from the lab manifested in her nightmares, her silences, and her almost pathological craving for a normal life. She wanted to see Mike. She wanted to go trick-or-treating for Halloween. She wanted to be a real girl. Hopper's constant emphatic no to her pleas was a source of deep and escalating conflict. He was trying to protect her from the monsters of the world, both human and interdimensional. But in doing so, he was starving her of the one thing she needed to heal: human connection. Their days fell into a strange, tense domestic routine. Hopper would return from work with food, always including a box of Eggos. He painstakingly taught her to read and write, using simple words to build a bridge between their two fractured worlds. He set up tripwires around the cabin's perimeter, a physical manifestation of his paranoia. But the isolation was eating away at Eleven. The quiet, monotonous waiting was a form of torture for a girl whose entire life had been a series of high-stakes, immediate events. The tension finally exploded in a massive fight. After Hopper broke his promise to be home on time, her frustration and sense of betrayal, coupled with her immense power, erupted. She screamed, and the cabin became a whirlwind of telekinetic fury. Books flew off shelves, windows shattered, and furniture was thrown about. It was the psychic tantrum of a profoundly powerful teenager who felt utterly trapped. The aftermath was a sullen, wounded silence that filled the small space for days, a chasm of unspoken pain between them. This was Eleven's rebuilding phase, a time of learning what a family, however broken and dysfunctional, could be. But it was also a period of intense isolation and simmering resentment, a quiet before the next inevitable storm. While Eleven was confined to the cabin, a prisoner of Hopper's protective love, a new and far more sinister threat was beginning to stir in the depths of the Upside Down. This wasn't a lone predator like the Demogorgon, it was something far older, far larger, and infinitely more intelligent. It was a consciousness, a vast and malevolent entity that had become aware of Hawkins when Eleven first tore open the gate. Now, with the gate sealed but the psychic wound between worlds still raw, it began to extend its influence. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as aberrations of nature. Farmers across Hawkins began reporting that entire fields of pumpkins were inexplicably rotting on the vine, covered in a strange, viscous black slime and interconnected by a network of fibrous grey tendrils that burrowed deep into the earth. The very soil of Hawkins seemed to be infected, sickened by a blight that had no earthly origin. At the same time, Will Byers, the boy who had been to the other side, was becoming a conduit for this new evil. His episodes were growing more frequent and more terrifying. He would see visions of the Upside Down, not as an empty, decaying echo of Hawkins, but as a world under the dominion of a new master. He saw a colossal creature that blotted out the sky, a swirling vortex of black particles and red lightning that resembled a monstrous spider-like shadow. It was a presence of such immense scale and malice that it dwarfed the Demogorgon entirely. The kids, falling back on their D&D lore to try and comprehend the incomprehensible, gave it a name, the Mind Flayer. This new threat was fundamentally different. It wasn't just a hunter, it was a conqueror, a hive-mind intelligence with a clear, terrifying goal: to spread, to consume, and to terraform their world into an extension of its own. Its re-emergence manifested in strange ways. A new, more agile form of creature began to appear, what Dustin would later dub demodogs. They were quadrupedal, smaller and faster than the original Demogorgon, and they moved with the coordinated purpose of a pack, hunting not just for food, but as soldiers in an invading army. They were digging a network of tunnels beneath Hawkins, spreading the infection, connecting the rotten pumpkin patches in a vast, subterranean web that converged on a single point deep beneath the earth. For Eleven, still trapped in the cabin, the signs of this new threat were distant rumbles, felt but not understood. Her own powers were becoming a source of intense frustration. She used them not to fight monsters, but to spy on the life she was missing. Creating a makeshift sensory deprivation chamber with a blindfold and the white noise of a television, she would enter the void, not to seek out enemies, but to find Mike. She watched him at school, in the arcade, in his basement, calling her name. These psychic intrusions were a bittersweet torture, deepening her loneliness and fueling her desperate desire to escape Hopper's prison. She felt the world moving on without her, her friends facing a new danger, while she was sidelined, treated like a fragile doll instead of the warrior she knew herself to be. The quiet life Hopper had imposed on her was becoming unbearable. The re-emergence of this new, shadowy threat, combined with her own painful isolation, was creating a perfect storm of adolescent rebellion and psychic power, pushing her closer and closer to a breaking point that would have profound consequences for everyone. The growing threat of the Mind Flayer created new alliances and deepened existing fractures within the expanding group of heroes. The social fabric of the party was first disrupted by the arrival of two new faces from California, Billy Hargrove and his stepsister, Max Mayfield. Billy was a whirlwind of aggressive, charismatic masculinity, a human antagonist whose casual cruelty and chaotic energy made him an immediate rival to Steve Harrington. Max was a zoomer, a skateboarding, arcade-hustling mystery who immediately caught the attention of both Dustin and Lucas. Her presence created a new internal conflict as the boys vied for her affection, and Mike, still grieving for 11, viewed her as an unwelcome intruder, an attempt to replace an irreplaceable member of their party. This new social dynamic, however, was soon overshadowed by 11's own explosive journey of self-discovery. Her isolation in the cabin, coupled with her burgeoning powers and teenage angst, led her to a critical discovery. Delving into the void, she turned her psychic gaze away from Mike and towards her own fractured past. She found her mother, Terry Ives. She saw Terry trapped in a waking coma, endlessly rocking in a chair, repeating a strange rhythmic mantra of words. Breathe, sunflower, rainbow, 3 to the right, 4 to the left, 450. It was a psychic echo, a memory loop worn smooth by years of obsessive repetition. 11 didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling behind them, a mother's unending, desperate search for a lost child. This revelation was the spark that lit the fuse of her rebellion. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a prison, keeping her from the truth of her own origins. After a volcanic argument with Hopper, she used her powers to burst free and ran away, embarking on a quest not to save a friend, but to find herself. Her journey led her first to the Ives household, a place frozen in time by grief. There, she met her aunt, Becky, and finally stood before her catatonic mother. The reunion was heartbreaking. Terry was physically present but mentally lost, her mind shattered by the cruel electroshock therapy Brenner's agents had used to silence her years ago. It was only when 11 took her mother's hand, bridging their minds in a powerful psychic connection, that the full, horrifying truth was revealed. 11 was plunged into Terry's memories, experiencing them as if they were her own. She saw the lab, felt the joy of the pregnancy, the terror of being told her baby was dead. Most importantly, she saw her mother's ferocious armed assault on Hawkins' lab to get her back, an act of maternal love that ended in her capture and brutal lobotomization. And within that vision, within the memory of the lab's rainbow room, she saw another little girl. This girl, with a tattoo of well elate on her wrist, looked at her with pity and fear. She had a sister. Armed with this new knowledge, 11 used her powers to locate this sister Kaylee in the urban jungle of Chicago. This created a new internal conflict within 11 herself. Her loyalty was torn. Her friends in Hawkins were in danger from a monster she was only beginning to comprehend. But the pull of finding a real family, someone who understood what she had been through, was overwhelmingly strong. She chose the new path. She left her mother and set off for Chicago, her heart a cold knot of grief and newfound purpose. Her arrival in Chicago introduced her to a new order. Kaylee's gang was a crew of outcasts, a found family of societal rejects bound together by a shared desire for vengeance against the people who had wronged them. There was Axel, a twitchy punk, Funshine, a gentle giant, and Mick, the stoic getaway driver. Kaylee herself was a stark contrast to 11. Older, more cynical, her power was not telekinesis, but the ability to create powerful illusions, to manipulate what people saw. She could make people see spiders that weren't there, or make the entire gang invisible to the police. She welcomed 11 not as a sister, but as a powerful new weapon for their crusade. This new family operated on a completely different moral code. In Hawkins, Eleven's powers were a shield, a tool for protecting her friends. In Kaylee's world, they were a sword, a weapon for hunting down and executing the former employees of Hawkins' lab. Carly taught Eleven to channel her anger, to use the pain of her past as fuel for her power. This seductive philosophy of righteous vengeance resonated with a deep part of Eleven, the part that had been hurt and abused for so long. She was given a punk makeover, dark clothes, slicked back hair, a new, tougher identity. She was no longer just 11, she was Jane, a girl reclaiming her name and her power. But this new order created a profound internal conflict. The lessons of Mike, that she was a hero, not a monster, and Hopper, that family protects, were at war with Kaylee's creed of an eye for an eye. She had found a sister, but she was in danger of losing herself. The Mind Flayer's infiltration of Hawkins reached a terrifying and critical turning point when it set a devastating trap, using Will Byers as the bait. After a series of increasingly violent episodes, Joyce and her allies realized that Will was not just having visions. He was a spy for the monster, his mind now a conquered territory. Every time they discussed their plans, the Mind Flayer was listening through Will's ears. The group, now including Bob Newby, Joyce's kind-hearted new boyfriend, devised a plan to communicate with the real Will, the small part of him still fighting back from within the prison of his own mind. They took him to the garden shed, a neutral location the monster didn't know, and used Morse code, tapped out by Will's finger, to get a single, desperate message from him. "Close gate." It was a revelation. To stop the monster and its army of demodogs, they had to go back to the source, to Hawkins' lab, and seal the interdimensional wound for good. But the Mind Flayer, through Will, knew their intentions. It orchestrated a catastrophic event to neutralize them. It sent a team of soldiers into the tunnel network beneath Hawkins, knowing full well it was an ambush. The soldiers were swarmed and slaughtered by the demodogs. The true horror of the trap was then revealed. As Hopper, who had been trapped in the tunnels himself and was now at the lab, watched in disbelief, the Mind Flayer used Will to draw all the demodogs directly to the lab itself. The building went into lockdown, the power cut, and the group, Hopper, Joyce, Mike, Will, and Bob, were trapped inside, hunted by a pack of monsters. The situation was a tactical nightmare. They were in the heart of enemy territory, with no power, no communications, and no escape. The hallways they had to navigate to reach the exit were a deadly maze patrolled by the demodogs. It was a catastrophic failure born from underestimating their enemy's intelligence. The villain's trap had been sprung perfectly. It was in this moment of absolute desperation that one of the story's most unlikely heroes had his finest and final hour, Bob Newby. Bob, the nerdy, perpetually optimistic manager of the local Radio Shack, was a man of puzzles and kindness, not a man of action. But when faced with an impossible situation, his particular set of skills became their only hope. The lab's computer system, which controlled the electronic locks on the doors, ran on BASIC, an archaic programming language that only Bob understood. He volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission, to navigate the treacherous, monster-filled hallways to the control room, reboot the system, and unlock the doors so the others could escape. The sequence was a masterclass in tension. Guided by Hopper over a walkie-talkie, Bob crept through the darkened lab, the screeches of the demodogs echoing all around him. He was unarmed, his only weapon, his intellect and his courage. At one point, he came face to face with a demodog, only surviving because Dr. Owens, wounded but alive, distracted it at the last second. He finally reached the control room, his hands shaking as he typed in the complex series of commands. "Easy peasy," he muttered, his catchphrase a prayer against the encroaching darkness. He succeeded. The power flickered on, and the locks throughout the building clicked open. He had given them a path to freedom. His frantic dash back to the lobby was a race against death. He was so close. He could see Joyce and Hopper through the glass doors, their faces a mixture of terror and hope. He was just feet away from safety when a demodog burst out of a side room, tackling him to the ground. The others could only watch in horror from the lobby as the scene unfolded. Joyce let out a raw, guttural scream of pure anguish. The moment was brutal and unflinching. A pack of demodogs swarmed Bob, tearing him apart. The last thing his friend saw was his terrified face as the monsters descended. Hopper had to physically drag a hysterical Joyce away from the scene as they made their escape. Bob Newby's death was a devastating, critical turning point. He was not a soldier, he was a civilian, a good, kind man who was a casualty of a war he never should have been part of. His sacrifice was not in vain. It bought the others the precious time they needed to escape with Will, but the emotional cost was immense. It stripped away any last vestiges of childhood adventure from the fight, replacing it with the grim, bloody reality of their stakes. The loss of Bob galvanized the group, hardening their resolve with a new layer of grief and anger. It was a shocking, tactical defeat that led to a profound moral victory in Bob's memory, setting the stage for the final, desperate push to close the gate and honor his sacrifice. The journey back to Hawkins was a race against time, a pilgrimage of purpose. On the bus, 11, still clad in the punk armor of her Chicago persona, underwent a profound internal transformation. The anger and desire for revenge that Kaylee had so expertly cultivated now seemed hollow, a pale imitation of the fierce, protective love she felt for her friends in Hawkins. She had stared into the abyss of what she could become, a killer, a vengeful angel, and had made a conscious choice to step back from the edge. This was not a fall from grace, it was her true ascension. She was shedding the identity of a weapon and fully embracing her role as a hero, not because someone told her to, but because she had decided it for herself. Her internal monologue was a quiet reckoning. The slicked back hair, the dark eyeliner, it was all a costume. Beneath it, she was still the girl who loved Eggo waffles and felt safe in Hopper's flannel shirts. She understood now that true strength wasn't measured by how much pain you could inflict, but by how much you were willing to endure for the people you loved. Her anger, which Kaylee had tried to sharpen into a dagger, was being reforged into a shield. It was still a white-hot core inside her, but it was no longer a tool for personal vengeance. It was fuel for a protective inferno she would unleash on any monster, human or otherwise, that threatened her home. She had finally understood the lesson Hopper had been trying so clumsily to teach her. Home wasn't a place you found, it was a place you fought for. This transformation was more than just a change of heart. It was a change in her very essence. She was no longer a lost, powerful child being pulled in different directions by the adults in her life. She was a young woman who had made a conscious, difficult choice about her own morality. She was no longer defined by the external pressures of Brenner's commands, Hopper's rules, or Kaylee's ideology. She was now guided by a single, unwavering internal compass, and its needle pointed directly at Hawkins. The choice to leave Carly was the climax of her personal journey of self-discovery. She had sought out her past, hoping to find an identity, only to realize that her identity wasn't in her origins, but in the connections she had forged in a small Indiana town. She was not Jane Ives, the victim. She was not 0111, the experiment. She was not the remorseless killer Kaylee wanted her to be. She was Elle, the friend, the daughter, the protector. This newfound clarity imbued her with a formidable confidence. When she arrived back in Hawkins, she wasn't just returning to save the day. She was returning to claim her place in the world she had chosen, ready to face any consequence to defend it. The fall of the persona she had built in Chicago was, in reality, the rise of the true 11. She had completed her hero's journey of the self and was now prepared to confront the ultimate evil that threatened her home, not as a conscripted soldier, but as a willing champion. Her return was perfectly timed, a moment of cinematic heroism. Just as the buyer's house was surrounded by a snarling pack of demodogs, the front door creaked open. There she stood, a silhouette of power and purpose, her transformation complete. The quiet, timid girl was gone, replaced by a warrior who knew exactly what and who she was fighting for. This was the hero they needed, returned from the wilderness, not broken, but forged anew in the fires of her own choices. The battle for Hawkins in the fall of 1984 was a sprawling, multi-front war against a vastly superior enemy, the Mind Flayer. With Eleven's return and the knowledge that the gate was the key, a desperate, complex plan was hatched. This was the second major conflict, a significant escalation from the single monster hunt of the previous year. The villain's methodology was far more sophisticated. It was using a psychic link to its host, Will, and a physical army of demodogs to wage a coordinated assault. The heroes, in turn, had to adapt, splitting their forces to fight a battle of strategy, brute force, and emotional endurance all at once. The plan had three critical components, each codependent on the others for success. The first front was in the tunnels. Steve Harrington, having completed his transformation from arrogant jock to the party's designated babysitter, led the younger kids, Dustin, Lucas, and Max, into the slimy, pulsating heart of the tunnel network. Their mission was a classic diversion: create a massive disturbance to draw the Demodog army away from the lab, giving Hopper and 11 the window they needed. Armed with gasoline, a lighter, and Steve's nail-studded baseball bat, they descended into the subterranean hellscape. It was a terrifying mission, a group of kids walking into the literal belly of the beast to play with fire. The second front was a battle for the soul, taking place at Hopper's isolated cabin. Joyce, Jonathan, and Nancy took an unconscious Will there, turning the small, rustic home into a makeshift sauna. Their goal was to perform a kind of psychic exorcism. Knowing the Mind Flayer and its extensions were vulnerable to heat, they cranked up every heater and fireplace they could find, intending to make Will's body an inhospitable inferno for the shadow monster possessing him. The process was agonizing, a psychological war waged with space heaters and a mother's fierce, unyielding love. Will's body convulsed and thrashed as the monster within him fought back, his screams a horrifying symphony of a boy's pain and a monster's rage. The third and most crucial front was at the epicenter of the invasion, Hawkins' lab. Here, Hopper and 11 descended into the depths of the facility, to the site of the massive, swirling vortex of red lightning and dark energy that was the gate to the Upside Down. The scene was apocalyptic, a vision of hell bleeding into their world. Their mission was simple in concept, but monumental in execution. Hopper would provide cover, holding off any demodogs that got through, while 11, the only person on Earth with the power to do so, would focus all her energy and will on closing the dimensional wound. She was the cannon, and he was her shield. As they prepared for the final stand, the Mind Flayer, sensing the imminent threat through its connection to the now purged Will, redirected its forces. A pack of demodogs, ignoring the fire in the tunnels, swarmed towards the lab, a last-ditch effort to protect their master's gateway. The final conflict was engaged. Hopper, armed with an assault rifle, stood his ground at the base of the platform lift, laying down a hail of gunfire against the charging monsters. He was a lone soldier against a legion, buying his daughter precious seconds with every bullet. Above him, 11 levitated into the air, a small, determined figure against the vast, terrifying backdrop of the gate. She drew on everything she had, her pain, her anger, and most importantly, the love she felt for her friends and for the man fighting for her below. Extending her hands, she unleashed a torrent of psychic energy, a raw, untamed force that slammed into the gate. The dimensional rift fought back, a titanic struggle of wills that pushed her to the absolute brink of her power. Blood poured from her nose and ears as she let out a silent, psychic scream, pouring every last ounce of her being into one final, world-saving act. The immediate aftermath of the gate's closure was a moment of fragile, exhausted triumph. Across Hawkins, the Demodogs, their psychic link to the Mind Flayer, severed, collapsed, and died. The invading army was neutralized. The Mind Flayer itself was banished, locked back in its dimension. At the lab, a depleted 11 collapsed onto the platform, caught by a proud and relieved Hopper. They had won. The war, for now, was over. In the weeks that followed, a semblance of normalcy returned, facilitated by Dr. Sam Owens, the conflicted but ultimately honorable scientist who had replaced Brenner. He kept his promise. In exchange for their silence about the events, he pulled strings, forging a birth certificate for 11, officially making her Jane Hopper. It was the ultimate prize, a legitimate identity, a father, and a place in the world she could call her own. This newfound peace and legitimacy culminated in a scene of pure, earned joy, the Hawkins Middle School snowball. For the first time, 11 was not a test subject or a weapon, but a teenage girl attending a dance. Dressed in a borrowed dress, her curly hair beginning to grow back, she looked like any other girl. The gym was a world away from the sterile labs and spore-filled darkness of the Upside Down. It was a fairy tale ending to a nightmare. Lucas and Max finally shared a kiss on the dance floor. Dustin, after a string of rejections, was saved by a compassionate Nancy Wheeler, who reminded him that girls his age were dumb, but he would one day drive them crazy. And then, across the crowded floor, Mike saw her. The reunion that had been a year in the making was quiet and perfect. They danced, awkward and sweet, to the hauntingly appropriate lyrics of the Police's "Every Breath You Take." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness, a resolution they had all bled for. But this perfect victory was a beautiful lie, a Pyrrhic victory at best. As the camera pulled away from the dancing children, from their innocent joy, it rotated, flipping the world upside down. We were shown the ghostly, ashen echo of Hawkins Middle School, blanketed in a perpetual winter of spores and decay. And looming over it, a colossal shadow of swirling black particles and red lightning, was the Mind Flayer. It was still there. It was watching them. The gate was closed, but the monster was not defeated. It was merely cut off, biding its time, its malevolent consciousness still fixed on the world it had failed to conquer. This final chilling shot completely recontextualized their victory. They hadn't won the war, they had merely survived a single, massive battle. The fairy tale ending of the snowball was revealed for what it was, a fragile, temporary peace. The losses they had endured, especially the brutal, heroic death of Bob Newby, cast a long, dark shadow over their celebration. The emotional scars remained, hidden just beneath the surface of their newfound normalcy. The true cost of the battle wasn't just in the blood that was shed, but in the lingering knowledge that the darkness was not gone. It was held at bay, waiting for the next crack in the wall, the next opportunity to seep back in. Their triumphant resolution was, in reality, just an intermission in a much larger, much darker story. The monster was still out there, and it remembered them. The year of peace following the Battle of Starcourt Mall unraveled the true, devastating cost of their latest victory. The explosion that closed the Russian gate had seemingly disintegrated Jim Hopper, leaving a wound in the group that was far deeper than any physical injury. For 11, the loss was catastrophic. She had lost her father, the man who had given her a home and a name, the anchor in her chaotic world. Compounding this grief was an even more personal loss. In the final battle against the Mind Flayer's grotesque physical form, a piece of the monster had lodged itself in her leg. The effort to telekinetically remove the parasitic flesh, combined with the sheer exhaustion of the fight, had completely drained her powers. She was no longer a superhero, she was just a grieving, powerless teenage girl. The immediate aftermath saw the fracturing of their entire world. The Byers family, with a now orphaned 11 in their care, made the painful but necessary decision to leave Hawkins. The town was no longer a home, it was a graveyard of memories, a place haunted by the ghosts of Bob Newby and now Jim Hopper. The scene of their departure was heartbreaking, a quiet depiction of the true cost of their war. The party, the fellowship that had been the unshakable core of their strength, was being broken apart. Mike and 11's tearful goodbye was a promise of long-distance love, but it was overshadowed by the uncertainty of their future. The true cost wasn't just the physical destruction or the lives lost, it was the dissolution of the found family they had built, the scattering of their fellowship to the winds. Their new life in the fictional town of Lenora Hills, California, was a continuation of this cost. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but it was an exercise in alienation. Without her powers, 11, now solely going by Jane, was just another awkward teenager. She struggled to fit in at her new high school, where she became the target of vicious bullying, most notably from a popular girl named Angela. She was adrift, lying to Mike in her letters about how happy she was, creating a fiction of a perfect life to mask the daily misery of her powerless existence. The cost of her survival was a profound and isolating loneliness, one born not of a secret lab, but of shared, unutterable grief. Meanwhile, back in Russia, the story revealed that Hopper was alive. He had survived the explosion by diving through the gate at the last second, only to be captured by the Russians and imprisoned in a brutal gulag in Kamchatka. His survival came at the cost of his freedom, thrown into a frozen hell where he was starved, beaten, and forced to fight a captive Demogorgon for the entertainment of his captors. The true cost of Starcourt was this separation, this immense physical and emotional distance that had been forced between all of them. The world had been saved once again, but the personal price was higher than ever. The heroes were scattered, weakened, and grieving. It was a fragile, broken peace, a lull in the storm that felt more like a slow, painful defeat. The monster may have been banished again, but the battle had left them more vulnerable and fractured than ever before, setting the stage for an even darker threat to emerge from the shadows and prey on their weaknesses. The long-term legacy of 11's journey is a truth so staggering it redefines the entire narrative of her life. This revelation came during her time in the Nina Project, the experimental sensory deprivation tank designed to restore her powers by forcing her to confront her most deeply suppressed memories. As she relived her time in Hawkins' lab, she wasn't just a traumatized child, she was a detective walking through the crime scene of her own past, piecing together a horrifying puzzle. The key to this puzzle was a kind, soft-spoken orderly who had befriended her in the lab. He was the only person who showed her compassion, teaching her to control her powers, encouraging her, and acting as a mentor in that sterile hell. He presented himself as a fellow prisoner, a victim of Brenner's ambition. He told her about his own past, revealing a tattoo on his wrist, 001. He was the original experiment. He then revealed his full story. His name was Henry Creel, a boy born with immense psychic abilities in the 1950s. He felt alienated from humanity, viewing people, including his own family, as a blight on the world. He used his powers to terrorize his family, creating illusions and killing small animals, acts that were blamed on a demon. This culminated in the gruesome murder of his mother and sister, an act of nihilistic rage for which his father was blamed and institutionalized. After falling into a coma, he was taken by Dr. Brenner, who saw in him not a monster, but a template. Henry Creel became number 1, the first in a long line of psychic children. The orderly's plan was revealed. He had been manipulating 11 from the beginning. He saw her immense power and believed they were kindred spirits, 2 superior beings destined to burn away the pesticide of humanity and reshape the world. He used her to remove a chip in his neck, a soteria that suppressed his powers. Once free, he unleashed his full, terrifying might, slaughtering everyone in Hawkins' lab. The memory she had suppressed was not of her being a monster, but of witnessing a massacre. He killed the guards, the scientists, and all the other numbered children in a display of psychic violence that was both awesome and horrifying. He then offered 11 his hand, asking her to join him to build a new world from the ashes of the old one. This was the ultimate crossroads of her life. She refused. Horrified by his cruelty and his nihilistic vision, she chose humanity. She chose the memory of her mother's love over his philosophy of hate. This refusal led to a furious psychic duel in the heart of the Rainbow Room. He was older, more experienced, and nearly killed her. But in a moment of near death, she channeled a memory of love, of her birth, and unleashed a wave of power she didn't know she possessed. She overpowered him, pinning him to the wall. But she did not kill him. In a final, desperate, instinctive act of banishment, she used her power to disintegrate the very fabric of reality behind him, opening the first ever gate to the Upside Down. She cast him into the raw, chaotic dimension. There, he was struck by its primordial energy, his body burned, twisted, and remade into the monstrous, lich-like being the kids of Hawkins would one day call Vecna. This is the long-term legacy and the most profound impact of her story. 11 did not just fight the monsters from the Upside Down, she created her greatest enemy. The ultimate villain of her story, the sentient, intelligent force behind the recent attacks, was the direct result of her first great act of defiance and mercy. She banished a human monster and in doing so transformed him into a supernatural one. This revelation permanently changes everything. Her entire life has been a closed loop, a battle against an evil she herself unleashed. The curse on Hawkins, the bleeding wound between worlds, all of it began with her. She is not just a victim of the lab or a hero who defends her friends. She is the architect of her own nightmare, her destiny inextricably and tragically linked to the very darkness she has spent her life fighting. The scars she carries are not just from what was done to her, but from what she herself has done, however righteous her intentions. The new status quo is a world where she understands her true, terrifying connection to the evil she must now face, an evil that wears the face of the first person she ever defeated. Her journey began in the sterile silence of a laboratory. A child stripped of her name, her identity reduced to a number tattooed on her wrist. She was forged to be a weapon, a tool for a secret war, her humanity a flickering candle in the cold wind of scientific ambition. But a chance encounter with a loyal fellowship of nerdy boys in a suburban basement began a different, more powerful experiment. They taught her about friendship, about promises, about the fierce, protective magic of a found family. She learned that power wasn't just for breaking things, it could be for protecting them. She became a girl who had to destroy a monster to find her friends, and then leave those friends to find a sister, only to realize that the family you choose is the one worth bleeding for. She closed a gate to another dimension, losing a father in the fire and her own power in the fallout. She was forced to dig through the graveyard of her own traumatic memories to reclaim her strength, only to unearth the most devastating truth of all, that her first great act of defiance, banishing a human monster instead of joining him, was the very act that created her arch-nemesis. She is a living paradox, a girl who is both the weapon and the hero, the creator and the destroyer of the very evil she is destined to fight. Her story is a testament to the idea that we are not defined by our origins but by our choices, not by the power we hold but by how we choose to wield it. But now, with her greatest enemy revealed and the gates to his world torn open, flooding her home with the darkness she unleashed, a final question remains. Can this weapon that learned to be a girl finally bring peace to her world, or is she destined to be locked in an eternal battle with the monster she made?